Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to this deep dive, where we're going to be looking at political pardons in the United States.
Yes.
A pardon is basically an act of clemency
Right.
granted by the president that forgives a federal offense. And it's a power that embodies this delicate balance
Yes.
between mercy and justice.
Absolutely.
And it's a balance that has really been tested time and time again throughout American history.
Yeah.
But most notably, perhaps in recent years, with the controversial pardons that we've seen issued by Presidents Trump and Biden.
Right.
So to set the stage for this discussion, I think it's important to take a step back and look at the historical roots of this power.
Right.
Where did this concept of a pardon come from?
So the concept of pardons is a very old concept. It actually dates back to ancient civilizations and medieval England, where rulers had the authority to forgive offenses.
Interesting.
So this power was eventually integrated into English common law, and ultimately it influenced the American legal system.
So even in colonial America, governors were wielding pardon power, similar to what the English monarchs had done before.
Absolutely, they did.
Setting this precedent for executive clemency in the U.S.
Yeah.
So it's kind of fascinating how this concept, originating in systems of absolute rule, found its way into a nation that's supposed to be founded on these democratic principles.
It really is, and it's one of the things that made the inclusion of the pardon power in the U.S. Constitution such a hotly debated topic during the 1787 Constitutional Convention.
Oh, sure.
You know, you had founding fathers like Alexander Hamilton, who, in Federalist Number 74, argued very passionately for its inclusion.
Yeah.
And he saw it as an indispensable element for preventing injustice and fostering reconciliation.
Makes sense.
Particularly in times of national crisis.
Right.
You know, he felt very strongly that the pardon power could prevent excessive punishments, could give second chances, and ultimately lead to a more just and equitable society.
But I imagine even back then, there was this concern about the potential for abuse.
Oh, absolutely. You know, you had figures like George Mason who worried that this pardon power could be used to shield people guilty of treason.
Right.
So essentially undermining the very fabric of the nation.
Wow.
So this tension between good and bad has always been there.
Wow.
And ultimately, the framers decided to include the power. But they put limited restrictions on it. And relied on things like the electoral process and impeachment as safeguards against abuse.
So they were putting their faith in the system of checks and balances.
Exactly.
To prevent things from going too far.
Right.
So let's dive into why a president would actually choose to use this power. What are some of the rationales behind granting these pardons?
Well, there are a multitude of reasons why pardons are granted. Sometimes it's just mercy and rehabilitation, offering a second chance to someone who has shown remorse. Or maybe they've received a disproportionately harsh sentence. And in those cases, it really highlights the human element of the legal system.
Right.
Because it acknowledges that circumstances and people can change.
Makes sense.
And that sometimes second chances are warranted.
And then there are cases where the pardon is used to correct errors in the judicial system itself.
Exactly. You know, in situations where there's been a wrongful conviction or when new evidence emerges, the pardon can acknowledge that the courts, while they strive for justice, aren't always infallible. And it can really be powerful for rectifying these miscarriages of justice.
Especially when the legal system hasn't been able to provide a remedy.
Exactly.
So it acts as a sort of safety valve.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
For the system recognizing its own limitations.
And then there are pardons that are granted to promote political stability, like fostering national unity and reconciliation after periods of intense division or conflict.
Like Andrew Johnson's pardons of former Confederates after the Civil War.
Exactly. Johnson's actions were very controversial. But they were driven by a desire to heal the country and bring the South back into the Union.
Yeah, it was recognizing that moving forward as a nation requires forgiveness. And a willingness to move on from past grievances.
And then you have some pardons that are used as instruments of foreign policy. Like releasing foreign nationals to advance diplomatic goals.
Interesting. So these examples show how pardons can be used not just for individual cases, but to achieve these larger strategic aims
Exactly.
on the national or even international stage.
Yeah, and this is where the subjective nature of the pardon power becomes really important.
Okay.
You know, while the intentions behind these pardons might be noble, the fact that they are ultimately decisions made by the president introduces this ambiguity and opens the door for potential misuse.
Right, because it comes down to their discretion.
Yeah.
And what they think is best. Which leads us to this idea of political pardons.
Right.
What sets those apart?
So the defining characteristic of a political pardon is its motive. It's an act of clemency driven by political calculations.
So not justice or mercy, but politics.
Exactly.
So we're talking about situations where the president might be protecting allies, rewarding supporters, or advancing some policy objective.
Precisely. And history is full of examples of these types of pardons.
Oh, I'm sure.
Which have often been very controversial.
Yeah, well, let's explore some of these landmark cases in U.S. history.
Okay.
To see how they've manifested over time.
Sure.
Maybe one of the most infamous and enduringly debated examples is Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon back in 1974.
Yeah, Ford's decision to pardon Nixon, who had resigned in disgrace in the middle of the Watergate scandal, still sparks a lot of debate. About, how the pardon power should be used. Ford, he became president after this crazy constitutional crisis. And he argued that pardoning Nixon was essential for the country to move on from the trauma of Watergate. He thought that a long legal battle would just divide the country even more, and that it would be harder to restore faith in the government if this kept dragging on.
But, of course, a lot of people saw it as him protecting Nixon from having to face the consequences of his actions.
Exactly.
So essentially putting him above the law. It really raised these huge questions about justice. And whether the pardon power could be used for political reasons instead of pursuing truth and accountability.
Yeah, the Nixon pardon really shows that tension at the heart of this power. Ford really believed he was doing what was best for the country. But his critics saw it as a betrayal of the public trust and this dangerous precedent that could lead to future presidents abusing this power.
It's a stark reminder that even with good intentions, using the pardon power can have huge and lasting consequences.
Absolutely.
It can shape how people view justice and the rule of law.
Exactly.
So going back in time a bit further, we have another important example of politically charged pardons. And that's Andrew Johnson's pardons of former Confederate officials after the Civil War.
Johnson became president after Lincoln was assassinated. And he had this daunting task of putting the country back together after years of brutal conflict. So his decision to pardon these people who had fought against the United States was part of his Reconstruction policy, trying to reconcile the South with the Union.
But his critics saw it as a betrayal.
They accused him of putting politics ahead of holding Confederate leaders accountable for what they did during the rebellion.
It shows how clemency is always tied to what's happening in the country.
Exactly.
At that time.
It
also shows how pardons can be used to push specific political agendas, even when those agendas clash with ideas of justice or accountability. These historical examples really show how complex and controversial the pardon power is. It can do a lot of good, but it can also be misused. And finding that balance has been tough throughout our history.
Absolutely.
Fast forwarding to more recent times, we have Jimmy Carter's pardon of Vietnam War draft evaders in 1977. Carter campaigned on restoring morality and integrity to the White House. And he saw the pardon as a way to heal from the Vietnam War. He recognized that the war was morally complicated. And wanted to offer a way to reconcile for those who had resisted the draft. Which they often did at great personal risk.
But his decision got mixed reactions.
Makes sense.
Some people applauded his compassion and his willingness to admit that the war had injustices. But others, especially veterans, felt that it downplayed their sacrifices. And made it seem like dodging the draft was the same as being patriotic.
So the Carter pardon highlights how hard it is to use the pardon power to address national division and trauma, even with good intentions. These decisions can bring back old wounds.
Or create new ones. And it shows how deeply divided a society can be.
It seems like with pardons, there's rarely a clear right answer.
Yeah, that's true.
There are always different perspectives and consequences to consider,
Right.
which makes these decisions some of the most difficult for any president.
Absolutely.
Bill Clinton's pardon of Marc Rich in 2001 is another big example of the controversies that happen when people question a pardon's motives.
Yeah.
Rich was a rich financier who fled the U.S. To avoid prosecution for tax evasion and other charges.
Right.
And Clinton pardoned him on his last day in office.
Wow.
Which immediately led to accusations of impropriety.
Because Rich's ex-wife had been a big donor to the Democratic Party and the Clinton Foundation.
Right.
So it looked like the pardon was a quid pro quo.
Yeah.
Basically a reward for past political support.
It made people even more cynical.
Yeah.
About the pardon power. Reinforcing this idea that it's used to help the wealthy and connected.
Exactly.
While everyone else is held to a different standard.
Right.
The Marc Rich pardon is still brought up.
Yeah.
In discussions about potential corruption in the pardon process.
Right.
It really highlights how important transparency and accountability are.
Absolutely.
Especially when it comes to people with close ties to the president or their political allies.
Yeah. These cases we've talked about, they span different eras and different motivations, but they all show the challenges that come with the pardon power.
Right. It can do good, but it can also be misused.
Yeah.
And figuring out that balance is a constant challenge for presidents.
Absolutely. And as we move into modern times, we see that pardons have become more connected with presidential politics and the use of power.
It's as if pardons are another tool for the president.
Yeah.
Not just to deal with individual cases, but to shape how the public sees them.
Right.
To push their policies. And even to strengthen their support base.
You're exactly right.
It's a keen observation.
Yeah, in today's world where everything the president does is scrutinized, the pardon power has become even more significant.
Okay.
And it's at the center of debates about executive authority.
Right.
And the possibility of its abuse.
Let's look at some actual numbers.
Sure.
To see how pardon usage has varied across different administrations.
Okay.
Let's start with Reagan and Bush Sr.
Okay.
How did their numbers compare?
So Reagan, during his two terms, granted a total of 393 pardons and commutations, but Bush granted far fewer, only 77 during his single term.
So a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
What about Clinton and Bush Jr.?
So Clinton, during his 8 years, issued a total of 459 pardons and commutations.
Okay.
And Bush, during his two terms, granted 200.
So more than double for Clinton.
Right.
What about Obama?
So Obama.
He was known for wanting to reform the criminal justice system.
Right.
Did that lead to more pardons?
It did.
Okay.
He granted a record number, a total of 1,927 during his two terms.
Okay.
And his focus was mainly on nonviolent drug offenders who had been given these harsh sentences under mandatory minimum sentencing laws.
Okay, so a big push for reform there.
Yeah.
And finally, Trump.
Yeah.
His use of the pardon power, as we've discussed, was very controversial. How does numbers stack up?
So he granted 237 pardons and commutations during his single term.
So less than Clinton and Obama.
Yes, but it's important to remember that a lot of his pardons went to political allies and people involved in scandals, which is why there was so much controversy.
So the numbers show us how pardon usage has gone up and down across different presidents, reflecting their priorities and political calculations. It's clear that they've used this power in very different ways, shaped by their own views and the political climate.
Exactly.
But it's not just about the numbers.
Right.
We need to understand how modern presidents have used pardons as tools to get what they want.
Right. Like Obama, for example.
Okay.
He used pardons to show his commitment to criminal justice reform by pardoning a lot of nonviolent drug offenders.
Right.
He wanted to bring attention to mass incarceration and push for fairer sentencing.
So the pardons were both an act of mercy and a way to influence the national conversation on an important social issue?
And presidents can also use pardons to strengthen their support base, like pardoning someone who's popular among their supporters.
Okay.
Even if that person's case is controversial.
Yeah.
Or doesn't fit the usual reasons for a pardon.
It's like rewarding loyalists.
Yeah.
And showing that the president is willing to help those who have supported them.
Exactly.
Even if it means causing controversy.
It's a way to show they care about their base.
Yeah.
And will fight for them.
Right.
But it does raise questions about whether justice is really the main concern.
Right.
Or if it's about political calculations.
Exactly.
It shows how pardon power, presidential politics, and public perception are all connected.
Absolutely.
It reminds us that even actions meant to be about mercy and justice can be used to achieve political goals, blurring the lines between doing the right thing and playing the game.
Exactly.
So let's talk about Trump and Biden.
Okay.
It's clear that their use of the pardon power has been really controversial.
Raising worries about potential abuse and loss of trust in the justice system.
Absolutely.
Let's start with Trump.
Okay.
One of the biggest criticisms is that his pardons, especially for people like Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, Steve Bannon, seem to be about obstructing justice rather than upholding it.
Exactly.
These people were all connected to investigation. It could have involved Trump himself. So it looks like he was using his pardon power to protect his allies and himself. It's like this power meant to safeguard against injustice was being used to weaken the rule of law and stop investigations.
It
makes you wonder if the pardon power can be used not just for personal gain, but to shield people from being held accountable for things that threaten our democracy.
It's a serious concern.
And the implications go beyond these individual cases. When people see pardons being used to obstruct justice or protect the powerful, it makes them lose faith in the fairness of the legal system.
Exactly.
It feels like there are different rules for the powerful and the rest of us. And that kind of selective justice is really damaging to a democratic society.
And Trump's actions also normalize partisan pardons.
How so?
Before, Trump pardons were seen as something exceptional, you know, like acts of mercy or ways to fix real injustices. But he used them so much for his political allies.
And people caught up in scandals.
That it made them seem like just another political tool to be used for advantage, not for justice. And that's a dangerous precedent. It could lead to future presidents doing the same thing. Making the pardon power even more political.
And less legitimate.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about Biden. His pardon of his son, Hunter, has also been really controversial. But for different reasons. What are the main issues there?
Well, the biggest concern is that it looks like nepotism. Critics say that pardoning your own family member, especially one facing legal trouble, that's become so political. Creates a big conflict of interest. It makes people wonder if the president is choosing family over being impartial.
Exactly.
And it feeds into this bigger problem of how divided our country is.
Absolutely.
The Hunter Biden pardon has become another battleground for the two parties. Opponents see it as clear corruption. Supporters say it was needed because the prosecution was political.
When even pardons are seen through this lens.
Political fighting. It further erodes public trust in both the justice system and our democratic institutions.
Absolutely.
And Biden's actions, like Trump's, show how pardons are being used as weapons in political battles.
It's not about justice and mercy anymore. It's about protecting yourself or attacking your opponents. So even though they're from different sides of the political spectrum, both Trump and Biden have used the pardon power in ways that raise concerns about its potential for abuse and how it's moving away from its intended purpose.
Exactly. It shows that the problems with pardons go beyond party lines,
And that we need to talk about reforming the process.
If we want to keep this power from being misused and make sure it's used responsibly, we need to fix the things that allow for abuse. And rebuild public trust in its legitimacy. So as we wrap up this deep dive into political pardons, it's clear that this power is at the heart of fundamental questions about justice, mercy, and the rule of law in a democracy.
Absolutely. It can be used to right wrongs, offer second chances.
And help the country heal. But it can also be used for political gain.
Yeah?
Favoring certain people. Yeah.
And even obstructing justice.
What Trump and Biden have done has really highlighted the weaknesses of the pardon process and the potential for it to be abused.
Right. It shows that we need to think about reforms to ensure that this power is used wisely and fairly. And in a way that supports the principles of our democracy. We encourage you to keep thinking about this complex issue and what these reforms could mean for the future of American democracy.
The pardon power belongs to the people. It's our responsibility to make sure it's used in a way that reflects our values and upholds the ideals of justice and accountability for everyone.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.